Nothing is too expensive. It's one of two things. There's either not enough value or there isn't enough budget. I think it comes down to the fact that a lot of salespeople learn or get trained to run a process. But actually, what fails to happen a lot of the time is that they don't really understand the principles behind that process.
The Next Gen Sales Leaders Podcast. Coffees for Closers.
What's up, guys? Welcome back to the Next Gen Sales Leader Podcast. My name is Benjamin Reed, and I'm here with Steve Radford. He is the founder of the Greater Sales Company, and he's the author of How to Sell. Welcome to the podcast.
Thank you, Benjamin.
So let's jump right into it. Tell me about the book, How to Sell. Where did that come from, and what's it about?
Okay, so the subtitle is Everything You Need to Think, Know, and Do to Have Greater Sales Conversations. So in a world where everything is about AI and tech stacks, this is a book that looks at the human side of selling. It helps people to build their foundational sales skills that they use through every type of conversation that they have. It's come out of, I've been training salespeople for 20 years. And this was a book I challenged myself to say, okay, there's a lot out there, but if you need to condense it down into the things that everybody needs to know as succinctly as possible. So 50,000 words for the book, or 6.5 hours for the audiobook. What would you need to put in it? And that's what the book is. So, yeah.
So tell me, for anybody listening, because I'm sure they're going to get great, you're going to tell us how to sell, but how did you learn all the things that you have in the book? What's your 30-second, 30,000-foot view pedigree on what gives you the credentials to teach people this?
Sure. Okay. So like most people who started in sales, you kind of fall into it. And my first few sales roles, I had no sales training at all. Baptism of fire, out in the field, learn on your feet. I then started a field sales agency. So I was running teams up to about 1,200 people in total. And at that point, it became clear. Okay. Yeah, 1,200. Yeah. So,
wow, okay.
Yeah. So tactical teams. So we had about 400 effective full-timers working tactically on different campaigns for different clients. And it became clear at that point that, yeah, people's natural ability is a starting point, but you need to kind of give them a leg up from there. So I learned a lot on that job, but then when I sold that agency, and what I did is I went back to university and I studied first work-based learning. So how to support people learning within the workplace. And then through working with the University of Derby, developed university level sales qualifications. So yeah, so I've done formal study as well as the informal study. And then I'm an avid reader, an avid learner. I believe that, every day is a school day. So yeah, it's a combination of learning over 20 years.
This is a break in the podcast to bring you our sponsor, RevyOps.com. That is REVYOPS.com, the #1 GTM data management platform for your GTM and revenue operations data on planet Earth. If you are using the modern stack of Clay and Instantly and Email Bison and RB2B and Trigify and all these various tools scattered across the wind, we unify all that data all into one place so you don't have any duplicates, a unified view of every single contact so you can see all the data and all the activities across all the platforms all in one place. It will allow you and your team to move faster, to get better attribution across the entire funnel, and to make a heck of a lot more money. Go to RevyOps.com, check out how you can get started today with me on a call where we'll learn about your data management problems and how we can get you guys to the next level of growth. See you guys at RevyOps.com. Go there now. It will be in the show notes as well down below. Let's get back to the podcast. Great. So now, is this more of a B2C sale? Is it B2B sale? Like, what would you say is your specialty?
I mainly work with B2B sales, frontline sales teams. But in the book, I use a few different sales teams as examples. And I'm a believer in foundational sales skills that translate. So there is a case study in the book from a sales team who are actually retail brand ambassadors who use simplified versions of exactly the same sales skills and conversational selling that B2B sales teams use. So most of the work I do is B2B, but yeah, there's stuff in there that's as applicable for B2C.
And just again, I'm trying to help focus the readers, or I say the listener's mind, but also my own mind on the scope here, because as you and I know, this is such a vast field, right? And so there's so many different kind of sales training courses out there, from Sandler to Miller Hyman, and all these different types of courses. And so obviously the size of deal it is, the pace of deal it is, the structure of the sales operations. Do you have SDRs and account executives and sales engineers? Is it just a full cycle deal? All of that comes into play. Where do you have a particular lane that you like to focus on, or does the training cover any type of sales situation?
Okay, so the three parts of the book: mindsets, knowledge, and skills. So the first part about mindsets is how it looks those deeply ingrained ways of thinking that guide you through almost any kind of sales conversation. So we look at win-win approach, we look at ROI, we look at building trust, how trust works, these kind of things. The knowledge is all about your base knowledge, what you need to know about you, what you're selling, your company, your organization. But part 3 of the book is where it comes to life. And this is my conversational sales process. And I get people to look at, let's say you've got a enterprise level sale. I get people to look at every individual conversation in that process as a sales conversation in its own right. I believe you're always selling something. It might be an idea, it might be a product, it might be a service, it might be the next step. But that conversation should be run in the same basic way that you do any conversation. So whether you're trying to land the sale in a single conversation, or whether what you're actually selling is, I'm going to deepen my understanding and I'm going to sell the customer on the next step in the process, the underlying process for that kind of conversation, I think, is the same. It's the same skill set. And it's also a good mindset to get people into. One of the things that you should have with every planned conversation is a range of objectives. And often when I talk to salespeople, let's say they're going into a discovery call, they'll talk about the objectives being what they want to get out of the call. Okay, well, what's the client going to get out of that call? How are we going to add value through that conversation? How are we going to move that client that little bit further towards the decision that we're hoping to get them to make further down the line? Let's think of selling that to them through the conversation, despite the fact that the heavy focus might be, discovery and understanding. But let's make sure that we're working towards that objective as part of the conversation. So that's the premise of part 3 of the book. Yeah.
Yeah. And I think it's a very obvious thing to think, okay, hey, like, what is the problem that we want to, or the objective we want to get to? But I think where it becomes confusing for some of the listeners that I can imagine, or like, I'm thinking of not a chief revenue officer who's been through many versions of this before, but more of a business owner, or somebody who's just getting into a different type of sale than they used to be. So there's many people that say come from some type of large tech B2B sale that has multiple pieces within the sales process that are part of the sales team. So again, your SDR, your sales support, your chief, your obviously the sales manager, but then there's some level of an account executive, a sales engineer, maybe even some back end additional sales support person. So you can have these very complex groups, but then you can also have, like I said before, it's just one guy who takes it end to end. And I think that what I've seen is that there's certain types of salespeople that get very used to a certain way of doing something. And then they go into a new context in a new company when they change jobs, and all of a sudden they're thrown into a new sales process. And they've only experienced one type of sales process before, maybe at their first job, or maybe it was very similar between 2 jobs and now they're in a different world. And I've actually seen this happen for when I hire my own account executives, or I hire account executives for other clients. And I have always been surprised by the degree to which this basic foundational understanding of explaining what has to occur in a sales conversation is important. It seems very basic, but context is actually what matters here. And in the context specifically is, what is the deal cycle? How big is the deal? What's the buying committee that has to be brought into the deal cycle? And depending upon the complexity of it, the goals of the call are going to be much different, right? And so I feel as though I've seen so many sales reps that come from more of a transactional sale, especially when you're in like more of a product-led company that maybe sells, $1,000 piece of software or $2,000 piece of software. And the sales reps are very used to just inbound leads on product-led growth. They take a call yeah, this is how it works. Here's a quick demo. Sure, we can onboard you and it's good to go, right? Obviously, you're trying to close a deal. But as soon as it becomes more complex, $20,000, $50,000, $150,000 type deals, $1 million type deals, and more people are brought into the buying cycle, I have found that many sales reps really struggle with that idea of building a buying committee and not going into a sale with the goal of selling the software, but rather getting agreement and digging into the incentives. And so I'm curious, how do you think about training sales reps given that world? Do you have something that addresses that?
I think it comes down to the fact that a lot of salespeople learn or get trained to run a process.
Mhm.
But actually, what fails to happen a lot of the time is that they don't really understand the principles behind that process. And that's where I kind of start. So my belief is you don't just tell people what to do and how to do it. You make sure they understand why it works. Because once they understand those underlying principles, they can translate it, exactly that same skill set or the basics of that skill set, to a new situation. Whether that be they adapt on the fly within their role, or as their role continues to evolve, or as they move from one company to another or one vertical to another. That's the thing. And that's why I think a lot of people struggle. They know a process from company A, the process in company B is different. Therefore, they feel like they're starting over. And it's because they're not grounding that process in core principles. I think once you do that, it becomes a lot easier to layer those high level skills on top. It also becomes a lot easier. So there's a company I train, and we train their entire workforce across this business on the basics of the model, so that everyone in their organization understands what underpins great sales conversations. So their marketing team goes through exactly the same basic sales training. Even their account management, everybody goes through that, that basic training, because it means that everybody works in a similar way on a principles basis. So when they start splitting out into their individual roles, there is a basic alignment there. And it really helps when we train the marketing team on it, for example. What they then produce for the sales team is much more effective as a result. And I think that's the core, and that's where the book sort of comes from. It's not going to teach you everything you need to know in every sales, scenario, but it's going to teach you what you need to know to have great sales conversations. And then you layer those additional, knowledge and skills on top of that.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I think that there's so many things that could be said on top of that, because I have something called the what matters diagram. And I built this diagram to explain to people that are new to the B2B sales cycle and the B2B sales methodologies and strategies and philosophies, because oftentimes somebody comes into this world, like a new business owner, had great product-led growth, has good product market fit, is now trying to stand up their first sales team. And I think that those that have not gone through this process before of building a sales team, but there's actually a real belief in the market, which I've been surprised by, is that, hey, I'll just hire a sales rep. I'll go grab HubSpot and I'll give them, I won't even give them a list. I'll just say, hey, I'll go start selling. There's not even like a list or a strategy. It's just, I got a sales guy. You said you could sell this. Go help me. And they basically put list building, sales operations, scripting, the entire, sales qualification metrics, all the technology squarely on the shoulders of this new sales rep. And the sales rep, unfortunately, or maybe fortunately, depending upon who they are, is put in this position of great responsibility. And they probably also realize that they've been given too much, but they're not going to say that, especially at a small company. They're just going to go, yeah, we can do that. And I've seen it happen so many times where it becomes the blind leading the blind, where it's the sales rep is not a chief revenue officer. They have not done the sales process in this industry before. They don't even know how to build a list. So they're probably going to just go to Apollo and try to scrape the most basic list they can get. And they're going to start pounding the phones. They probably won't have a rigorous CRM process. So it's going to be the bare minimum. And then the 3 months later, when the business owner comes in and says, so what's happened? Oh, well, we got some deals and there's some deals going on, and look, there's a pipeline. And that's basically, well, I'm not getting results here. So, and there's no way to audit it. There's no way to identify constraints in the process. And it's just this kind of, well, the sales rep sucked. I need to get another sales rep. And so then they rinse and they repeat that entire mistake. But I think you're right, is that even before a sales rep can come in, you have to have the process, you have to have the offer, you have to have the market selected, you have to have all these things in place. And people have put too much emphasis on the sales rep. I would say that the only argument against that is if in what you're saying, which is, okay, if I made the mistake that I just described business owners making, it would be give people a value-based, principles-based selling system that allows somebody to think through any situation with a set of core principles. Like, for example, one of mine is never pitch into the dark, right? Just a core principle of I will never show you a piece of software. I will never show you what I sell until I understand what problem I'm solving, because otherwise I'm just wasting time. That's just like a core principle. Another core principle I have is if you don't have it, I don't have time. But what that means is if you don't have the traits, the characteristics, the required setup, the budget, anything else, then I'm just simply not going to even waste my time pitching to you, because you don't have it in the first place. I can't give you some things that have to be true for my solution to work. So it's like a simple idea. If you don't have it, I don't have time, but it applies to the framework of the sales rep. So I'm curious, like, those are some of my principles. What would you say your core principles are in a selling conversation?
Okay, so there's a number. The key one is the basic principle of win-win, right?
Mm-hmm.
Never set an objective unless you can articulate why it's good for the client and good for you too. You might have supporting objectives, which you also want to achieve, but an objective for a conversation, let's break it down to an individual conversation. That objective, you should be able to articulate how it helps the client, the prospects, as well as it helps you. If you can't do that, then we're not going into that conversation. In the same perspective of a demo, don't show anything unless you're showing how it actually helps the client achieve something that's meaningful. And really, don't even get to that point unless you can explain it in the client's words. So it is that principle of stop living in your world as a salesperson and stop trying to see the conversation through the eyes of the customer, and always have that dual lens. You've got to balance the two. It's got to be good for both parties. But you'd be amazed how you put that lens over things repeatedly with experienced salespeople, and it subtly changes the conversation. They'll spend a little bit longer thinking through the objectives for a conversation. They'll spend a little bit longer in the discovery or understanding phase. Not necessarily just understanding the need, but getting to understand, okay, what's the customer's language around that need? How am I going to explain our solution to them in a way that doesn't just speak to their underlying KPIs or their commercial goals, but actually in a way that kind of matches their values as an organization, so we feel like we're a partner. And I think that one simple principle, when you overlay it and come back to it time and time again, makes small but real measurable changes. And it means the conversations you have are more enjoyable for customers. Because the other part of that is stop looking at customers as businesses. Yes, they're businesses, but we sell to people. Do you know what that individual's KPIs are? And is there anything that we can do that helps move the needle for them as an individual in their organization, not just the commercial goals they've got? And again, it comes back to that win-win. What are we giving people? How are we adding value through all of those conversations? And do we really understand how to articulate it well to that customer in language that speaks to them? I mean, that's the first chapter of the book. And it still amazes me how I deal with salespeople who've been selling for 20 or 30 years. And when they think about that and go back to something they probably haven't thought about properly for 10, 20 years, whatever, it subtly changes what they do in a good way.
I went through a life coaching program called Ascension Leadership Academy about 10 years ago. And the way it worked was, imagine 150, 200 people in a hotel type conference room, big arching ceilings, and just like, we're all in a big circle. And the way the whole process worked was you got into these little, what they call containers, which is this little kind of simulated games that you had to play amongst all the players. And everybody was on equal hierarchy. There was no leaders. There was nobody, voted into a position or something. So imagine a bunch of equal professionals coming into a room. You don't know anybody, and it's like very awkward, and you're just meeting everyone for the first time. But it was a very interesting experience because the first game we played was called the Red and Black game. And the Red and Black game was where they split the room into two cohorts and they separated them into two rooms. And the way that we worked was there was 10 votes. And the way the vote worked was you could either vote red or you could vote black. And if you voted red, then something could happen. And if you voted black, something could happen. Long story short is there was a way to, at every step of that voting process, was to screw the other team. So you could win the game by outthinking them, essentially. You could basically say, like, look, they think we're going to go black, black, we're fine. But if we go red, black, then something bad happens for the other team. And you could start thinking through like how you can manipulate the outcome psychologically. The moral of the story was, at the end of it, the only way to truly win the game was to do a win-win situation. And so you had to think not only think of yourself as altruistic and positive and well-meaning, but you had to also think about the other team in that light too, to come out to the right outcome. And what was more fascinating about the process wasn't that was the moral of the story. It was how human beings self-organized within that constraint. So in other words, we're in these rooms, we can't hear what they're saying, and everyone's like, oh, they're going to screw us, right? It was like kind of like the Cuban Missile Crisis kind of thing, where it's like, they're going to push the button and like, we got to screw them first. We got to get them in the first. And so that was one layer of it. But then there was this other layer of, there was no hierarchy. So people had to come to the front of the room, and who were the more bold of us had to go to the front of the room and say, I have an idea. This is how I think we should do it. And I remember I got up there and I tried to say something and I got basically booed off stage. This one girl literally said, let's stab him, get that guy off stage. But it was just a perfect example about how you're right that there is this, it's a simple philosophical way of being and thinking, which is to believe we can all win and do it well. But I think the natural fear of human beings is that there's a scarcity zero-sum game at play. And I think that the truth in my own experience too is there can be win-win. And it doesn't mean about giving away leverage or giving away power. It just means that if it's not win-win, it's an unsustainable, ill-incentivized setup. And it will collapse at some point now or in the future because the incentives aren't aligned. So I say all that to say, I had this very deep lesson 10 years ago on this particular subject. And I would say it's taught me actually in deals that it's always, I'm saying I defaulted towards wanting the client to win at my expense. And what I realized was that was bad. And for now, I even had a guy on the call the other day say, I tried to do discovery on him and he's like, I have an allergic reaction to discovery. And I was like, well, I have an allergic reaction to pitching to people I don't know who I'm pitching to. So I'm like, I guess we should end the call. And he immediately pulled back and he was like, oh, well, I guess what kind of questions you have? And I'm like, look, I'm trying to help you because at the end of the day, I can show you an hour-long demo. I can tell you all about my tool, and I'll completely waste your time and I'll waste mine. And it'll be frustrating for both of us. Or I could ask a couple questions, understand your problem, and maybe I can tell you this isn't a good fit for me right now. But that comes from the win-win. It's like I protected myself in that case. So win-win was a key piece. Do you have any thoughts on what I just said? Any reflection on that? Or do you want to go to the next principle?
Yeah, no, there's a couple of thoughts on that. There's a famous study where I think it was Princeton University. They pitched they put teams from two different business schools together. And they said, we're going to put you into a negotiation challenge. And they had two scenarios. The core negotiation was very simple. And it was kind of similar to what you've just described. But they set the start of the negotiation up very differently for the two teams. And it was the only difference between the two. One team, they were told, right, time's money, get at it, let's get this done. The other team, they were told, right, before you start the negotiation, just find something that the two of you have got in common. The team that spent the time doing that, not only did they reach the outcome quicker, they were much more successful at finding an outcome which was acceptable to both sides, because they felt like they were now trying to solve a problem together. They were opposing teams, but by finding some commonality between the two, they felt like all of a sudden, no, actually, the problem we're overcoming together is trying to find a solution that works for both of us, rather than I'm trying to outcompete you or out-negotiate you. So I think one of the things you can do with salespeople is just show why things like that make it, this is not just us being nice, right? This is how to be more efficient, and more effective. The other thought on that was, I'm similar in that I have a bit of an allergy to discovery. I tell people to never use that word with prospects and customers, partly because, well, it sounds very one-sided, right? So I use the word understanding instead. And actually, the other reason you don't want to use discovery, it's fact-finding. Well, in this day, you're going to walk into the room or the meeting with information that you could and should have found out before, especially in the world of AI. I'm not going to tell you the answer to that question as a client. I'm going to essentially throw you out as being, terrible at what you do. Coming in and going, okay, this is what I've discovered. Help me to understand it a little bit more deeply and what it means for you is, again, a slightly different thing. And all of a sudden, again, that can change the nature of that conversation. So there's lots of ways that you can spin that. So that's kind of chapter 1 of the book. It's the win-win thing. Chapter 2, we talked about the next principle is, so I put these in terms of coaching questions. The first question to ask as a coach is it a win-win? The second question to ask is there enough trust? All sales involve getting a customer to move from one place to another. The size of the gap is equal to the amount of trust that you need, or that they need in you as an individual, you as your brand, you as a solution, in order to help them make that leap. If you try and push them to make that leap, and there's a mismatch between the amount of trust and the size of the distance they've got to move, you're not going to get it over the line. So the second principle is, make sure you've taken the time to think about that and ask yourself, have we earned enough trust here yet to move that customer, or to recommend that customer that we move them from one place to another? And again, that can, in some cases, it will slow things down. It puts another lens on things, but it makes it changes the nature of that conversation. Salespeople will do things that are more rapport building because they don't see it as just being nice. They see it as building trust, which will result in them being more effective at closing the sale later on. So that's the second principle.
Yeah, so I have my own book called The $1 Million Pitch Method. And the first chapter of the book is all about trust. And the thing I say to people, like, the number one thing you can to earn trust is be a subject matter expert. And the reason for that is because it's something that's like your being. It's, my mom said to me, it's probably the wisest thing I ever heard my mom say, which was, I used to want to over-explain myself, especially when I was in my 20s. I'm 37 now. So I just felt this need to be like, well, I'm this and this and this, and this is how it works. And I over-explained. And she said, look, trying to explain yourself to people or worry about what the people perceive you as and constantly control every little muscle fiber in your face neurotically, the way that in a particular tactical discussion on sales could go in that direction, which is if you look like this, and if you move like that, I see all these trainings on tone of voice, and hey, Bob, and that kind of thing. And I always think it's focused on the wrong thing, because then it becomes this very scripted kind of way of being. And my experience has been, I've seen people that have very soft tones that speak kind of like this. And I've had people that are very intense and they're straight in your face, and they all work. So I look for what is the core thing that actually seems to matter. And for me, it's that the person really knows their shit. And it's evident. You don't have to explain it. They don't have to say, here are my credentials. Just from the way that they speak, the customer knows that they have a deep understanding. Yes, if you are pitching to lawyers, you probably would like to be a lawyer or some type of law degree. If you're pitching to MDs, having a MD, PhD wouldn't hurt you. But if it's something else, like for example, I've sold a lot of software within oil and gas. I have no background in oil and gas. But what I have done is I've had 1,000 conversations with the most random guys in the middle of the desert, and I perfectly speak their language, and I can perfectly tell you where the corner truck stop is. I'll be like, oh, I was down at Harry's the other day. And I was like, yeah, exactly. When you turn right on the bypass, you're going to get completely crushed under the overpass. If I can just say that in 3 words, it's like, oh, this guy knows me, you know? So that's kind of where I take it from. But I think you said something earlier, which is, I used to be kind of anti-rapport building, which is kind of ironic, because I was like, it's a waste of my time. And I was very brain-centered, very logical, very fact. And I didn't understand the role of emotions in decision-making in my younger years. And I, having gone through so many emotional training courses and having done a deep reflection on myself at this point, I realized at the end of the day, it's purely an emotional decision. There is logic involved. Yes, things have to align. But I found that if I spend 2 minutes just shooting the shit about whatever comes up on the front of the call, not fake in a fake way, but in a genuine interested way of like, you're another human being, you're across the world. What's going on in your life? You know, like, I know it's funny. We're sitting here on Zoom. You know, what are you up to? Oh, that's crazy. Just doing that for 2 minutes. Then you get into the sale and it feels human. And I feel like I can feel that energy pull through the entire conversation. And I used to feel annoyed by that and it felt fake to me. But I realize now that that's a huge part of trust building with human beings, which I know it's kind of obvious. Maybe I'm too Spock-like, but how do you feel about those two ideas?
So I completely agree with you, first of all, right? I don't talk about rapport building because people see it as, yeah, it's a bit fake. It's a bit, I've just got to we're going to ask some nice questions, you know, just to get to the next bit. So we talk about building trust and building understanding and that kind of thing, right? But I mentioned earlier about mindsets. And so the book is Mindsets, Knowledge and Skills. And the reason I build it that way is if you have the right mindsets, you're believable. People are really good at spotting when people are trying to put a face on, or they've learned a technique, or they're trying to emulate something, you know. It's like mirroring and matching. It's like, you know, at best, try and match that person's level of energy and enthusiasm. But that's as far as you should go. Build those mindsets and help those underpin, your behaviors, and you'll be a much more believable person. But the other one I do is, we talked about principles. I get them to think, so as well as, is it a win-win and is there enough trust? What's their gut feeling? And again, that breaks through, a lot of the BS. Oh, well, I presented them this, we've done this, and we've gone through this process, and I think they're ready for this, and KPIs are here, and the dashboard's saying X, and going, what do you think their gut's feeling? And that's when people will tell you actually what they think that person on the other side of the screen or the other side of the room, is going on in their head. So it can be really simple ideas, but it is that thing, because as humans, we're great at reading micro expressions. We don't necessarily recognize them for what they are, but you do get this feeling. So yeah, as part of the chapter in the book, what's your gut feeling, we talk about, system 1 and system 2 in the brain, logical decision making versus emotional decision making. And there's loads of, things that you can do to show people you can't turn off that, system 1 emotional decision maker in your brain. I'll give you an example. So when I ran my field sales agency, we had a client we'd been working with for 3 years, big banking client, Santander. So we did a lot of work with them. And essentially we would go in and we would essentially sell things on behalf of Santander to branches. We'd sell the branch on ideas and things that head office wanted them to implement. We had to repitch for the contract 3 years in. Big organization. So again, it was okay. So procurement got involved, and as a team, they had to narrow it down to 3 suppliers. And at that point, we were passed over to procurement. We went into a reverse bidding auction. I don't know if you've been involved in one of those before.
Mm-hmm.
And literally it was lowest price gets it. And, we went through this process and it was absolutely horrible. And we learned that, no, that's our lowest price. And we knew that one of the other suppliers had undercut us. So we thought, okay, that's it. We've lost that contract. And the next day, our client rang us up and said, right, okay, so we need you to come in and we need to now talk about contract terms. And when we got into it later, it was a case of you weren't the lowest cost, but you feel like people we can work with. So even though procurement put this really robust commercial lens over everything, they'd done all their due diligence, and in theory, any one of those three suppliers could have delivered that. So let's just put an objective, factual lens over the top. It was that gut feeling that they said, no, these are people we can work with. So there is always that emotional decision maker in the mix, and it's usually more powerful than you think it is, even in what appears to be very commercial-led decisions.
Mm-hmm. I feel like oftentimes I learned a really big lesson about procurement negotiations about 8 years ago, I would say, 8 years ago, where I was selling a piece of software, very, very advanced, like central database ETL, which stands for extraction, transformation, loading. It's a way of moving data between systems, tool for the oil and gas industry. We had won a $500,000 annual consulting contract, which was time and material of human work. When it came up for renewal, we'd actually built out a platform called subsurface.io, and it was really a SaaS play more than anything. We went into, so it came up for renewal. They knew that it was going to transfer into a SaaS contract. That was agreed upon at the front, that it was going to be more time and material. So year one, we'd build it out, and then we would hand it over. It would turn into recurring. And they knew it was also going to be much more expensive because we were going to roll it out globally. So that it was a pilot at $500K. So we went into the initial procurement phase with the procurement officer at, I think it was $2.5 million. And he came back to me and he said, you're completely out of market. All your competition is saying that it's far lower, and you're not going to be even considered at this price. Now, for anybody listening, the procurement officer, if you don't know what that is, it is like the Darth Vader to the Luke Skywalker. If salespeople are the Luke Skywalker, the procurement officer is literally commissioned on how much they cut you down. So they are incentivized to get you to give up discounts. So generally speaking, you should just double your price and then just get them back to the normal price. That's been my experience. But so then it became this tit for tat on what category of product we were in. And they were putting us in a BI product category, like putting us next to like a Tableau. And we were like, no, we're actually a CDP, a client data platform, which is a fundamentally different category. It's more expensive. And they were disagreeing. So the business owner, my business partner, I only owned 10% of the company. He got very nervous because this was our main contract and he just didn't want to lose it. So he ended up forcing me to come down dramatically. So I came down to $1.5 million, then $900,000. And they kept on saying the same thing. You're out of market. You're out of market. So finally we came down to 750,000. Finally, we're down to 300,000. I'm like, this is the most ridiculous thing. And then I asked just point blank, I said, because they were like, look, you need to get down to 300K. So I got down to 300K and I said to the procurement officer, I said, look, if we do 300K, are we guaranteed the deal? And his response was, no, you've already lost the deal. I just wanted to see how far I could get you down. So the deal had been lost a month before. They made a decision and the guy was fucking with us. And that's a real story. And he was just playing games. So the truth is I have found very rarely is discounting the path to the win. It is always value aligned, and it is always about the best alternative in the market. And I think to some degree there is that gut feel piece of it, but I think all of this comes back to believability. If we're willing to go from $2.5 million to 300K, it actually, that process in itself undercuts credibility and undercuts the believability and the ability to fulfill the service. Why would somebody who has a defensible position that has a good enough market demand and has supply and demand in their favor be willing to discount like that? And the answer is nobody. And I think the procurement officer who's seen a bunch knows that. So I think as we started to discount, we lost favor in the deal and they started looking for alternatives. But that's just one example where discounting is rarely the answer. And oftentimes I've won significantly higher contracts than somebody else in my company believed we could win, simply because we always just repositioned the mindset around where the value was. And we came in with real numbers and we said, here's the proof, here's the proof, here's the proof. So, yeah,
And
it's interesting. It's counterintuitive, huh?
it is, but it comes down to the basics. So basic negotiation skills, right? I don't use magic words very often. 4 magic words in a negotiation: if you, then I, right? It's always a trade. That's what we're doing in a negotiation, right? So a negotiation, objection handling is where you stand your ground. Yeah. And sometimes if that fails, you have to move into a negotiation. But if you're going to move, they're going to move too. Now, the goal is to find something that is valuable to them that you can offer, and they can offer something that's valuable to do. But the cost is, again, is different on both sides. But it's about showing people, okay, I can lower the cost, but in order to do that, we're going to have to compromise on this area of the service, or we're going to have to find an area of the service that, we both have to compromise on. As soon as customers realize, okay, there is going to be a consequence. I've got a salesperson who's helped me try to get to where I need to be, but they're telling me, yeah, we just need to change the shape of things. That changes the shape of the conversation. Because as soon as they ask for something and you say yes, you get the salami effect, which is what you've just described. It's okay. Oh, yes, and. Okay, and I want, and I want. And they'll just keep asking and chipping until you put something back in there, the ball in their court. I'll give you another example. This is it's sales, but non-sales story. So a very good friend of mine used to be a talent agent. And his particular niche was he'd break new presenters into the TV market and sports and mainstream TV. But he ran a small agency, and he was pitching for a client against some of the biggest agencies out there. And he said there were 2 or 3 meetings in, and they knew this was a big deal for him and his agency. And whenever he'd gone for the meeting, there was 2 people. There was, the senior person and the slightly more junior person who sort of sat back. Came to the final negotiation, and the senior person didn't show up. And he thought, right, I've got to try something here. I don't know whether I'm going to get this across the line. So he's like, right, okay. Tell you what, we both want to try and get this deal done today. Why don't we say that I started here, and then you counted here, and actually then we settled on a number which was a lot closer to the number that you gave me. And they went, okay, let's do that. And shook hands there and then. Because what he'd realized in that moment was what this person wanted was to go back and show their boss that they were a tough negotiator and they could get this across the line and get that discount. So what he traded in that instance wasn't the discount. We didn't give away the discount. He traded it for that immediate agreement. And that's sometimes you will give a discount, but that's the trade. I could potentially, and you don't say, yes, you can have it. Can we get the deal signed? If we can get there, is this a deal that we can get signed with no other changes? And you trade it that way. And again, it's that basic principles of negotiation, theory. It's always a trade. Don't give stuff away because they'll just never stop asking. Like that example you just shared, right?
Yeah.
Well,
that's literally what happened.
Yeah.
I mean, what you just described, which is like, and that's where I asked, if I do this for you, not saying we can, but if I did this for you, I have to go back and talk to the powers that be. But if I do this for you, does this guarantee the deal? Can we get this done this week? I don't know. And I'd be like, well, then I can't continue to reduce price without any sense of a give back. And the reality is that, like I said, the deal, if there's a negotiation happening, there's obviously in an enterprise context, generally that's like a year, half a year, 2 years, 3 years into a deal cycle. And there's been tremendous amounts of leverage that should have been built up before then, right? In our case, we actually had a $500,000 pilot that went very well. So there should be leverage points to point to, but I just, for me, on it's so easy just to come back and just discount. And the truth is like, now that I've been in enough negotiations, I just know it's all bullshit. Like it's a bunch of monkeys sending like big numbers around, like, oh, I think it's this and I think it's that. And it's just like, there's logic behind it. But at the end of the day, it's some guy going like, like there's some hard costs, at least in software, I'm sure there's hard costs and there's underlying compute costs if it's like data processing. But beyond that, like the margin is like, you could shave it off here or there. So it really comes down to, do you deeply understand the value? I had an example just the other day with Reviops, which is my software company, where this guy jumped on and he was saying, it's just, this is really expensive, and I can't afford it. And his entire definition of afford, and therefore he asked for a discount. And so I said, your entire definition of afford is based upon the idea that you have to spend money for software. And I said to him, the real thing that I think you should be defining expense based upon is unit economics, which is, if you pay for this thing, can you get a lot more out of it? Or can we prevent a lot of bad things from not happening? And he didn't understand this, which has kind of been surprising, but it goes to show the basics go far, which is, and this comes back to subject matter expertise, which is, I said to him, like, let's like walk through an example here. I was like, and I showed him the entire funnel for B2B sales, because we sell essentially an analytics platform and a central database platform to help you optimize your conversion rates across the entire funnel. And so what I showed to him was, look, if you send a cold email, then you get a reply, then you get an interested reply, then you get a meeting booked, and then you get a qualified deal, and then you get a proposal, and then you get a one deal. Let's just say that's the process. Maybe it changes from company to company. I went in to show them a spreadsheet, and I said, look, 90% of your cost to acquire the company comes post lead capture. So let's say that you get your meeting set for $300, and let's say 70% show. So now you're at like 400 and change in terms of the set meeting, 33% get qualified, let's say. So now you're at like $1,000 or so on the qualified deal. And then you have the proposal stage, which maybe only 50% get to, and then a 25% close rate, or something like that. I showed him, I'm like, look, like most of your cost is actually on the conversion points. So if we can lift this by 4%, lift that by 3%, and we can build it up, you can actually reduce your cost to acquire by 30%, 40%. And so rather than spending, say, $6,000 cost to acquire, you're spending $2,500 cost to acquire. So the problem is that right now you don't know how to conversion optimize at all, because you can't even see the conversion points and you're missing it across all these systems. So your loss of not working with us is you are forever and always constrained on knowing where your constraints are. You don't know where they are. You can never conversion optimize. So you might walk out of this meeting and you don't spend your $20,000, but in the process, on every single deal, you're losing $3,000. And you've already told me you do 400 deals a year, 400 times $3,000. You've just lost $1.2 million because you don't want to spend $20,000. Like, does that make sense? And he was like, I never thought of it like that.
And there's two key principles you demonstrated there. That one was, fear of loss is always a more powerful motivator than gain. That's the way we're programmed as humans, right? We fear losing something. We much more fear, losing out on something than we do, than we are motivated to gain something that's additional. And so repositioning that value as, you're losing money here already, I can help you stop losing what you're losing. The other thing was about, you talked about, it's too expensive. I had this thing that nothing's too expensive. Nothing is too expensive. It's one of two things. There's either not enough value or there isn't enough budget. Okay. I mean, if I said to you, I can sell you a car for $100,000, you'd say, that's quite an expensive car. Then I'd tell you it was a McLaren F1. You're like, oh, no, actually, that sounds like great value, but I still haven't got the money to buy it, or whatever it might be. It's one of those two things. And that's where, when you get those lines, it's too expensive. those key principles of objection handling. Okay, let's dig into this. Let's understand that a little bit more, because there's more going on here than just expense. And if it's budget, let's establish that now, because it doesn't matter how good a case I make for the value we can provide. If you haven't got the budget, you haven't got the budget. But if it's not a budget issue, if it's a value issue, well, let's attack this in a different way. And that's the example you just gave, which is, let's talk about this as I can help you stop hemorrhaging margin, which is essentially what you're doing at the moment, right? Yeah.
Yeah. I think that it's so easy in the sale to do all the work and get to the end of the sales rainbow and be there in that negotiation. And either one, not recognize the opportunity to reframe the conversation, or just fold to the demand of the client because there's this neediness. And, I mean, anybody who's kind of been in sales long enough has read the Challenger sale, and they've done all these like kind of personality assessments across all these types of salespeople, and they saw the highest close rates. This big study, and they basically concluded the number one personality type that actually won the most was the Challenger. It was the person that can, as it describes, basically challenge the belief set or the framing or the perspective of the client in a way that is not antagonistic and allows the deal to get done. And what I have found out in sales, but also in terms of just, I think, any professional that I've worked with, I have both liked working with and respected I would say almost the contrarian type of prickly personality who is willing to stand for their position and make a very good case, assuming that they're a subject matter expert and assuming that they are making a good argument. But I have found that where I get really annoyed in a sales cycle, because I'm also allergic to discovery. I think any salesperson is allergic to discovery. I have found that I think it's more human just to be kind of just direct and raw and honest. And I think this gets back to that likability factor and the trust factor, which is, I think being trusting does not mean being nice, and it doesn't mean being pleasant. And although you can be, but my favorite salespeople, my favorite developers, and my favorite product people, they're kind of terse. They're kind of assholes.
Yeah.
And I kind of like it, but the thing is there's no bullshit. You can smell there's no bullshit. That's that gut feeling. And you're in good hands. Yeah, they're going to kind of rub you the wrong way on occasion. But you might want to strangle them from time to time, but that sometimes they're right, and you trust them. And it's just like, you might not like what your parents said when you were growing up, but you still respected them to some degree. Again, I'm projecting here, but you still were able to go, I see their point and I get it. And I know they have the best intention for me. And I think like one of the last things I'll leave this here is, because I know we're running out of time, is one of the core ideas, I think psychologically, that I've learned in my life is that this applies to management, this applies to friends, this applies to family, is that the ability to give somebody feedback is based upon the fundamental belief that you have the person's best interest in mind. And this comes back to the win-win principle. If they truly believe that you are trying to attain a win-win, then that means they also believe that you have their best interest in mind, to some degree, right? Obviously, you want to do it for yourself too, but you're not antagonistic, and you're trying to align incentives. And so if that's true, then you can also realize, okay, we're able to move the deal forward in a meaningful way with some level of believability and some level of appreciation, regardless of how likable the person is, regardless of how nice they come across or whether somebody likes you or not. So I don't know. I just think that people over-index on this need to be liked. And I think they should more over-index on the need to be effective and to be trusted. And that's not the same thing. And I think that's like, it's gone a long way for me. I've won really big deals by being an asshole.
So the analogy is, we talk about consultative selling, and the analogy is a consultant in the medical world. If you had a serious medical issue and you went to see a consultant who specialized in that area, and they prescribed a recommended course of action and you challenged it and they immediately backed down and caved, what would you think? You know, that's not what you expect from an expert in their area. They've taken the time to understand your position. They've diagnosed and prescribed what they think is the best course of action. You'd expect them to stick to their guns, right? And I've got personal experience of this recently. I've got a back issue. I've got some discs in my back that are collapsing. And the guy I was seeing said, look, I think it's time we referred you to a specialist guy down in London. Just be warned, he's a bit arrogant. And my reaction was good, because I want him to just tell me what to do, right? You know, that's the thing. He can be arrogant. If he's the expert you say he is, and I trust your judgment in that area, I expect him to kind of be like that way, you know. And
It's
that's
right.
the salespeople like to say, if you're an expert, yeah, give your expert opinion and stand by it.
Well, this is, I guess, gets back to the point of, so I think of the different types of sales, right? There's super enterprise, $10 million type of deals. You know, you're selling nuclear reactor type stuff. And then you have, you know, your door to door, you're peddling, you know, a bottle of, you know, car wash stuff to your local neighbors. I think that the higher the ticket goes, the more equal the person has to perceive you as. And so like and in fact, it's actually the opposite, which is ironic in the low end sale in my experience. So what I mean by that is that when you go knock on somebody's door, you're probably as low status as they could possibly imagine you being, right? You've knocked on the door, unannounced. They have no clue who you are. You're invading their personal property, and you're sitting there with a bottle of cleaner, and they're like, "Who's this asshole selling this like $20 cleaner?" It's the worst positioning you could possibly be from a status perspective. The way that I used to sell door to door, so I'm not hitting. The way that I overcame that was I actually just played into that role, which is like, "Hi, how are you? My name is Ben." And I would be the friendliest, most submissive puppy dog like character. Because if I came in with like my enterprise level hat and like my challenger hat, they'd kick me off the property. But what I found is that the higher the ticket goes, and the more of a long sales cycle where you have to be in multiple relationships, it's important to be perceived as a peer and not as somebody who's selling to somebody. So for me, that's where the more I sell high ticket, the less there's pitch decks, there's software demos. It's actually more just a conversation. And it's simply a matter, kind of like you said, of like you go into a doctor's office. The doctor doesn't pull up the 5,000 studies and charts to explain to you why you're about to die. They say, we just did a blood test. Here's the result. This is what it is. Here's your options. Which one do you want? You know, or not even which one do you want? You need this option, you know, period. And you have an alternative. We don't recommend it. The only reason you would do this is because you really hate needles. Whatever, I'm making it up. But for me, it's like, you're right. It's like when you get to a certain level, there has to be an arrogance. A last thing, just to drill this home, is there was a podcast with, this is like more of a human dynamics thing, but there was a podcast with Joe Rogan, and there was a podcast with Matthew McConaughey on the Joe Rogan podcast. And I remember watching it, and Matthew McConaughey, you know, I mean, as everyone knows, like an elite actor, well-respected, kind of has a vibrato, a suave kind of guy. And then there's Joe Rogan, who's also, you know, biggest podcaster in the world, well-respected, but two macho men. And Matthew McConaughey leans back in his chair and throws his foot up on the desk, barefoot. And Joe Rogan, you can see, looks at the foot, and he goes, "You're the first man to put a barefoot on this desk." And then Matthew McConaughey laughs, doesn't remove the foot, and then continues talking and having the discussion. And then Joe laughs, and they keep on going as if nothing happened. Now, that could have gone multiple ways. One, Matthew McConaughey may not have put foot on the desk, right? Out of respect. Or he could have been like, "Oh, I'm so sorry," and pull it up, right? Now, I'm not saying go into your client's office and put your feet on people's desks. That's not the point. The point is that the reason Matthew McConaughey could get away with it was because of the way that he was positioned from all of his status in his mind, in the mind of Joe Rogan. And so it just goes to show that a certain perception of status allows you to get away with things you couldn't normally get. And there's no like trick to this. You can't fake this. I think the only way to get status is to actually be credible and actually have good content and actually put stuff out. So it's every little interaction, and people want these, very simple, like, let me smile and let me say stuff. And I say, look, you got to just come in knowing your shit, being extremely experienced, and having a very direct approach to the best answer, because you know why it's the best. You know all the alternatives, you know all the competitors, you can explain it inside and out. You can, if they want that explanation, you can give it to them. But at some point, they'll just believe you. And it's because it's evident. And there's nothing else to say. It's this guy is the best out there. So for me, like I think a good place to leave this podcast is my number one goal on a sales call is very simple. Is I want to prove to that person that there's nobody else on planet Earth that can help them in the way that I can help them, by demonstrating my subject matter expertise on the matter, and how that my product or my service or my solution, along with me and my company, can perfectly solve their problem in a very unique way. And it's believable. It's not just, hey, I can do this and here's how the product looks and work and here's the features. There's like this feeling, this like, holy shit, we got to work with that guy. We got to work with that. What they're doing over there. And then they go and jump on the next call and there's like a side-by-side comparison. I just want it to be so obviously like that they're missing out. That's my core goal.
And good salespeople make that look easy. And people starting out are looking for that. What's that one magic thing they did? And they don't realize that, no, sales is a complicated thing. It's a human interaction. There's a lot going on. You make it look easy with a lot of knowledge and experience and practice, right? Stop looking for that magic answer. What's that one thing? Whether it be body language or a tool or whatever. No, it's learn your craft, right? This is, I'm still learning. I'll still be learning for the next 20 years, I'm sure. It's, yeah. And why I love it. That's why I love sales. There's loads to learn. Always loads to learn.
I would say that if I had to give anybody like one silver bullet, it's not a silver bullet, but it's a silver path, it's not even about sales. It's about your own self-actualization and development as a human being. Is that if you go and you really look at your own bullshit and you deeply want to challenge your own false beliefs and you want to deeply understand where your emotions are coming from and understand your emotions and how you react to people. And it sounds very heady and psychological, but I've noticed that everything that has prevented me from performing in a conversation with a human has always been my own perception of my own self or the hidden things I did not know about myself. And the only way to go through that is to heavily invest in personal development, go to various programs, put yourself in weird situations to try things out, go do things that are scary. I mean, there's 1,000 ways you can develop as a character, as they would say, as a human being. But that's ultimately, I think, what makes people effective. I think some salespeople, most of the best salespeople are born to some degree. I do believe that there's some people that just have it. They have that natural je ne sais quoi capability. But I think the elite are separated from, they're just cool, interesting people that are deeply knowledgeable. And that is like, it's a taste thing. It's like you cannot put it into a formula. You cannot put it into a structure. You cannot teach it. It is, the human being is just somebody that is believable. And where does that come from? It comes from deep on the ground hardship and failure and experience and self-reflection. And living a full life. I really believe that people have to go on their own personal journey. And 25-year-old, 23-year-old kid coming out of school, who's like, well, show me this tactic. I'm like, go do hard shit and fail and, be embarrassed, and you will find yourself,
And deeply believe there's always a way to do it better. Your job is to find it.
Exactly. Yeah. So where can people find you? I know we're over time here. What's the best way to contact you or find you online?
Okay, so I love having conversations with people, and the best place to connect with me is LinkedIn. So Steve Radford, look me up on LinkedIn, throw me a connection request. I'd love to have a conversation there.
Great. So anybody who wants to check them out, show notes below. There'll be links. You can always find us on YouTube and Spotify and all the different RSS feeds. So again, Next Gen Sales Leader Podcast. My name is Ben Reed. Thanks for being on the show, and we will see you guys on the next episode. See you later.